So, how do we set research priorities that are inclusive, socially responsible, and relevant to people of all genders?
Let's talk about it.
Gender matters!
Every day, all over the world, researchers and funders make decisions about what's important to study and how best to do it.
Right now in psychology, a lot of researchers are studying the brain using imaging techniques. Focusing on the neurological basis of behavior, thinking, and emotion seems to be a current research priority in psychology.
So, what does gender-based analysis, or GBA, have to do with setting research priorities? GBA helps us examine how gender norms influence research priorities. Gender norms are sets of beliefs and attitudes about what is considered appropriate for people of different genders. These norms often refer to the oversimplified binary of male masculine and female feminine.
The critical questions here are, how do sex and gender norms influence or guide research priorities, and how might assumptions about gender shape or limit research outcomes and agendas?
So let's think about this. For a long time, most psychological research was designed and conducted by men and used men only as research participants. How might this have shaped or limited research priorities and outcomes?
Well, first, it meant that topics of concern to women, trans, and non-binary people were simply absent from psychological research. So not just not a priority, but actually not studied at all. Sexual assault, menstruation, and menopause, psychology had pretty much nothing to say. And if there was research, it often made women and femininity into problems. This started to shift in the 1970s when feminist psychologists began to change things.
Second, it meant that research programs were invisibly gendered masculine. They reflected male researchers' assumptions about the world. Outcomes based only on men were generalized to everyone and taken to be universal.
A good example would be Lawrence Kohlberg's work on moral development. He presented a series of moral dilemmas to male undergraduate students at Harvard University. Based on their responses to these dilemmas, he constructed a supposedly universal hierarchy of moral reasoning. But when one of his colleagues, Carol Gilligan, presented a different set of dilemmas to women, she found that some women used a style of reasoning based on what she called an ethic of care. This had not emerged in Kohlberg's work, and women were consistently scoring lower on his scale. She argued that a psychology based solely on men was simply incomplete.
Okay, so obviously a lot has changed in psychology, and now we are studying women and women's experiences. It took us a while to address this gender gap, and there's still a ways to go. We still don't have a lot of data, especially in the developing world, on some of the most basic experiences of women and girls. In many countries, statistics on unpaid labor, care work, and domestic violence have not been collected. This absence of data has serious implications for policymaking.
By not counting these experiences, it's like women and girls themselves don't count, let alone genderqueer folks.
Okay, so I'm designing my first big research project. What else should I consider when thinking about my priorities?
Great question. Another thing to consider is, what gender norms will be challenged or reinforced when we prioritize a particular line of research? One obvious example is gender differences research. Psychologists have long been fascinated by how women and men differ, and they've prioritized this agenda over showing how similar the genders actually are.
If we are interested in differences, there are several things we need to think about. What will happen, for example, if we do a study and don't find any differences?
Okay, well I guess we'll have proven that cisgender women and men aren't that different.
You'd think so, but it is actually more complicated. Showing no difference in psychology doesn't actually mean we've proven that the two groups are really the same. It just means that we didn't find a big enough difference to count this time. What happens more often is researchers ignore or discount findings of no difference, even when many of these studies begin to pile up, and they keep doing research until they find a difference. What I mean is, most of the time, differences research actually does show that women and men are more similar than different, but these results are not the ones that get reported.
So what happens if we do find a difference in our study? Does that mean that folks really are different?
Well, that is probably what a lot of people will think, and especially if it confirms what they already believe, that men are from Mars, women are from Venus, and non-binary people don't exist. But seriously, if the same differences keep popping up across studies, people will eventually begin to believe that a difference does exist, but there's still a huge problem.
Studies that show differences between women and men usually tell us nothing about the cause of the difference. How will we know whether we've measured stereotypes, socialization, or innate, unchanging, essential differences? What are essential differences anyway? Remember, nobody develops in a bubble.
Okay, so maybe I shouldn't prioritize gender differences research. Are there any other important questions to ask when deciding on a research agenda?
There are a couple more. You should ask yourself, who will benefit from the research and who might be left out? Will the research have different effects on women and men, or in particular groups of women and men, or people elsewhere on the gender spectrum? For example, when psychologists investigate gender and race differences, who benefits from the findings? There's a long history in psychology that continues to this day of interpreting difference as inferiority or deficiency for members of underrepresented groups. For example, if a researcher studies assertiveness and women are found to be less assertive than men, this is taken to be a problem rather than as a difference, because we assume that male behavior is the ideal or norm against which everyone else should be compared.
I didn't realize there was so much to think about.
There really is, but let's return to the research priority we started out with. There is already so much research in psychology focused on showing how male brains versus female brains are different. For a long time, psychologists also tried to prove that black people versus white people had different brains too, and guess whose brains were almost always portrayed as being better no matter what the findings actually were.
Remember that gender-based analysis prompts you to consider a whole range of issues so that your research can be as inclusive, socially responsible, and relevant as possible. It helps you set better, more gender-sensitive research priorities.
Thanks for checking out our video. Click the link below to explore the rest of the videos in this series.
Also take a look at Psychology's Feminist Voices website for more resources about feminism, gender, intersectionality, and psychology.
Remember, gender matters.